This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today is Wednesday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. Today, we're going to look at the worst land cycles. A cycle is a collection of cards usually released in a single set or block, all of which have a similar design. In most cycles, each color or faction ends up with a card. Land cycles are a central part of Magic. Every standard format has at least one cycle of dual lands, and they can really determine how good mana is in a format. We've had amazing land cycles since the beginning with the original dual lands. There are also lots of impressive utility land cycles too. Basically, lands that have the upgrade of being able to produce more than one color of mana or that bring some extra utility are great. Generating some extra value out of lands which already produce mana for you is a big deal. However, not all land cycles are created equal, and there are some truly awful ones out there, and that's what we're going to look at today. Most of the time, for cards to end up on my worst list, they have to have never been played in any 60-card competitive format, they have to be bad and limited, and they have to not be widely played in EDH. Most of the cycles on this list do meet that requirement, but as we'll see, some of these land cycles were played in block-constructed formats, others were fine and limited, and some of them are even okay to play in EDH, though they certainly aren't optimal. In general, most land cycles have a much higher ceiling than other worst cards can, since most of them can produce mana and frequently more than one color. So, worst is definitely relative to other land cycles out there. Alright, with that out of the way, let's dive in with my picks for the 10 worst land cycles of all time. At number 10, I have the Invasion Uncommon Dual Lands. These are very simple. They each produce 2 allied colors of mana, but enter the battlefield tapped. Lands entering tapped is a pretty massive downside. It drastically slows down your board development, and if you get one of these early instead of a basic land that enters untapped, it can really hurt. There are just a lot of better dual lands out there that either enter the battlefield untapped in many situations, or provide some extra upside like gaining 1 life, or providing snow or gate typing. But this cycle doesn't do any of that. In a vacuum, these cards aren't bad, but because most land cycles tend to be so good, these are bad enough to make the list. These are fine to play in EDH if you're really on a budget, but I think you'll find yourself wanting to upgrade your lands after playing with them for a while, because they're pretty underwhelming. At number 9, I have the Layer Cycle from Plane Shift. Each of these can produce mana from one of the shards, and they all carry the Layer subtype. When these lands enter the battlefield, you have to sacrifice them unless you return a non-layer to your hand. That's a pretty big downside. It means you can basically never play this on turn 1, and if you have multiples, you're really in trouble. Obviously, in EDH, you don't have to worry about multiples, but you effectively end up setting yourself back 1 mana to fix your mana, and that's not great. The Ravnica Bounce lands work out much better because they produce 2 mana, so you don't actually set back your mana development when you play them, but you definitely do with the Layer Cycle. Now, these do see a decent amount of play in EDH, but that's largely because there aren't very many Tri-lands in Magic. These are by far the worst true Tri-lands in the game, and if we continue to get Tri-lands in the future, the layers will definitely stop making it into decks. And I'm not entirely convinced you should be playing these at all in EDH, unless your deck has some special synergy when it comes to bouncing lands. While the first 2 cycles we've looked at aren't completely awful, there is a pretty steep drop-off when we get to the top 8 on this list. For all of them, you'd be better off not playing them at all. At number 8, I have the Tempest Pain Lands. These are very similar to the Invasion Duels. They enter tapped and can produce 2 colors of mana. However, there's an additional downside here that definitely makes them worse. They also do 1 damage to you every time you tap them for colored mana. Entering tapped is already enough of a downside that you really shouldn't have to lose life just to fix your mana with these. At number 7, I have the Odyssey Sack Lands. Each color has one and they all enter the battlefield tapped, can tap for a single color of mana, and you can tap and sacrifice them to produce 1 mana of any color. Again, lands entering tapped is a massive downside, and these aren't even really dual lands. These can produce mana of any color, but only at a great cost. You have to sacrifice the land entirely. While there are some shenanigans you can do with the graveyard and some payoffs for sacrificing things, especially in EDH, the fact that these enter tapped keeps you from doing anything too silly when you play them out of your graveyard. At number 6, I've got 2 cycles, and that's because they're made up of cards that are identical, apart from their names. One of these cycles is from Tempest, and the other from Champions of Kamigawa. There are 5 in both cycles, and they both produce 2 allied colors of mana. These lands do enter untapped, so that's a plus, but I would argue that the downside they do have is even worse. When you tap them for colored mana, they don't untap during your next untap step, so you usually only have access to any mana from these every other turn. Even if you want to produce colorless mana on the next turn after you've produced colored mana, you can't because it didn't untap. That is rough, to say the least. In most situations, I would rather have my land enter tapped, but then be freely available for me from then on. I will say the Kamigawa lands at least all have really amazing art from John Avon, which I talked about in my top 10 on bad cards with great art, so at least they have that going for them. At number 5, I have the Mercadian Mask storage lands. These all enter the battlefield tapped, and they can only be tapped for mana once they have storage counters on them. You can tap one of these to put a storage counter on it, so if you want to get 1 mana out of these, it will take you 3 turns. First it enters tapped, then the next turn you put a storage counter on it, then after that you need more storage counters to make it produce more mana. Now, there is some upside here, and that is that you can accumulate a bunch of counters on each of these to make a lot of mana at once, but that takes some significant time, and the downside of these taking so long to produce mana is awful. At number 4, I have the Depletion Counter lands from Ice Age. These are somewhat similar to the Tempest Kamigawa lands we looked at earlier, but even worse. The lands in this cycle can all tap for 2 colors of mana, but they don't untap when they have a depletion counter on them, and they get a depletion counter every time you tap them for mana. So, like with the other lands, you only get mana out of this every other turn, but what makes the depletion lands even worse is the fact that they can't also tap for colorless mana without a punishment. At least the Kamigawa and Tempest lands can. It's pretty amazing that these cards were rares in Ice Age, and they're on the reserve list, and they're dual lands, but they're still incredibly cheap to obtain. This is because there's absolutely no demand for them at all, because they're awful. At number 3, it is the other storage land cycle, this one from Fallen Empires, and even worse than the masked storage lands we saw earlier. These enter tapped, and they can be tapped, and you can remove counters to add an amount of mana equal to the number of storage counters on them. That's the same. The difference from the Masks lands is how you put the storage counters on them in the first place. In this case, you choose not to untap them, and that puts a storage counter on them. This is even worse than the Masks storage lands for a few reasons. First, you have to make a decision about whether you want to put a counter on them before you draw your card for your turn. Second, at least with the Masks storage lands, if you can find ways to untap them and tap them over and over again, you can get a bunch of counters in a single turn, but that just doesn't work here since it isn't an ability. You only get the option to put storage counters on them during your untap step. This is another land cycle that's on the reserve list, but you can get them for about 79 cents a piece because no one wants them. At number 2, I have the Homelands Filter lands. While these do enter untapped, unlike some of the cards on this list, the rest of what this cycle does is terrible. Each shard has one of these, and they all tap for colorless mana, but they can filter mana too. You can pay 1 and tap it for 1 color of mana, or you can pay 2 and tap it for 2 different colors. Obviously, the fact that these don't produce colored mana at all without you filtering your mana is awful. Filtering mana is weak in general, and we see a strictly better version of this card all the time these days. It's had many names, but we see a common land all the time that can tap for 1 colorless mana, or you can pay 1 and tap it to produce mana of any color. That's way better than these, and it still isn't very good. Having to pay 1 mana for the first color is bad enough, but having to pay 2 for each of the other colors is horrendous. For example, you have to tap 3 lands to produce white or red mana with Anhava Township, and that just isn't worth it. And at number 1, probably not surprising anyone, it's the Bands with Other cycle from Legends. These lands don't produce any mana, and they provide a pretty underwhelming effect, one that certainly doesn't make up for their lack of mana. Banding is a famously convoluted mechanic that allows your creatures to attack and block as a group, and you get to decide how combat damage is divided. Bands with Other is a strictly worse form of banding because it only allows you to have your creatures with a matching quality to band, and in this case that means only legendary creatures of the right color. So yeah, these do provide some upside, and this can be true in a Legendary Matters deck, but this narrow form of banding simply isn't good enough to make up for the fact that playing this takes up a land drop and it doesn't produce any mana. So those are my picks for the 10 worst land cycles in Magic. If you want to own these cards for some reason, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them. If you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch past videos, including many more that look at the worst cards in the game, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that on Patreon or by becoming a channel member. You can find ways to do both of those things in the description. Thanks for watching.